Good evening. Welcome to our Bible study tonight. It's a great day, and it is a great time to look at our biblical ancestors and reconnect with them in new ways. This is our continuation of Dr. Claypool's book, Glad Reunion, and today we're going to look at the person of Isaiah. You know, our religious forebears were so varied, come from so many different places, all kinds of backgrounds. Amos was just a goat herder, yet became a prophet. Elijah was a penniless sojourner, is how he calls it. Isaiah, on the other hand, was at the opposite end of that spectrum. We would call him an aristocrat. We would call him a man of power and a man of influence. He says that he was of the highest order. He says the whole life of the prophet Isaiah was spent in Jerusalem, well connected with all the culture. It says for a period of over 40 years, under four different kings, he had easy access to the palace and was often sought out by the rulers for his counsel. So he was described as one theologian as easily the greatest man of his day. The book of Isaiah is the longest of any of the prophetic documents in the Old Testament. And as we see the cycle unfold in the Old Testament of the people losing their way and God sending someone to help them get back, and they are restored in God's favor, and the cycle goes over and over again. This is what Isaiah is certainly a part of, and he's totally indignant in what he sees going on around him. You know, the people had got so caught up in just thinking in their minds that if they had their religious services right, that everything else was okay. And Isaiah said, no, he's not. God is not interested in your smoky sacrifice or elaborate ritual. God wants from his people, what he wants is their love and compassion and for their justice for their fellow human beings. And Israel at this point had forgotten this once again, started to lapse back into kinds of paganisms. But he says Isaiah's concept of God and and he wanted to teach the people what God was really like. Don't just go through this ritual and act like you're done. Well, the first thing that he points out is that Isaiah had an incredible astoundedness, I would say, at the great mystery of God, how the reality of God was so mysterious. He said he had, like many of us have had, a religious experience as a young man. This one was that it was at a time. It's interesting that today is inauguration day, because when he had this religious experience and encountered God's presence, he describes it in the year that King Uzziah died. Well, Uzziah had been king for 40 years, one of the most successful kings. And so people's world was turned upside down. So he describes it as a time of disillusionment because he had idolized this king growing up. They say that King Uzziah was the most effective king since the time of Solomon. Well, he says this is describing his experience. One day in the temple, he had become this is what King Uzziah did. This was how he died. And I'll bet you've not heard this story before. If you had, it's been a long time. But listen to what happened with King Uzziah. It said one day in the temple, he had become impatient about the way the incenses were being offered and had arrogantly gotten up and pushed aside the appointed priest and with his own unordained hands had offered the sacrifice. In that culture, this was an act of blasphemy. And he says, and before King Uzziah left the temple, blotches of white had begun to show on his face and hands, a sign of the onset of leprosy. Uzziah's affliction had been widely interpreted as God's judgment on his pride, and the king, who had once been loved so dearly, had been relegated to a leper's village, where he died not long thereafter. Did you know that? That's an incredible story, so you can imagine what impact that it had on the people during that time. He says Uzziah's sin was reflective of the attitude of the whole nation. He was one example of how the whole people of Israel had lost their way. And he says Isaiah, for one, began to ponder, quote, the God question with a fresh sense of fear and trembling. Then one day in the temple, Isaiah had his experience with God. He felt that God had happened to him, had overwhelmed him, had encountered him. He encountered the Creator himself. Describes this vision that he had of his holiness, his vastness, his mercy. And out of this experience, Isaiah began to speak of God as, quote, the Holy One of Israel and the Lord of hosts. And he emphasizes this word holy because we tend to not use it the way that it was intended. It said its original intention was, quote, to be separate and refer to the uniqueness, the distinctness, the one-of-a-kindness of a person or object. To call God holy meant that he was utterly different from anything else. And this is the truth that needs to be the beginning point of all of our reflections about him. So through this experience, Isaiah is trying to reconcile the people who had lost their way, started getting back into paganism type of things. Isaiah had a radical openness, a willingness to let this Creator, assume whatever shape he will, and to trust that he can make himself known without analogy. So, a completely different, authentic experience is what he was describing. He says, from this beginning point of holiness, Isaiah moved on to recognize the vastness of God. And I love the example he uses here, talking about the vastness of God. He talks about what a telescope and what a microscope do. He says both instruments show that there is more to the universe than meets the naked eye. A telescope enables us to see a vastness beyond the reach of our farthest sight, while a microscope enables us to see the minuteness of detail that is beneath our natural powers. Isn't that just exceptional writing? He says Isaiah learned the same thing could be said of God, that he is bigger than Israel had imagined, but also near, vast, but also very close to us. He says the other important truth to be learned from Isaiah has to do with the way he understood himself in relation to the purpose of God. In this experience that he had, he says, he's recognizing that he's a people of unclean lips, that he has unclean lips. Yet the seraph touches his tongue and said, now that this has touched you, your sin has departed you. And then who will go for us? And of course, Isaiah says, here I am, send me. He says the important point here is that Isaiah saw obedience to God as a way of self-realization, not a way of self-denial. In his thinking, the doing of God's will was the completion of creation rather than negation of it. In other words, all of us, when we think about the will of God for our lives, is that a negative thing? Are we having to give something up? Or should the will of God for our lives have to do with our fulfillment and the happiness and the joy that God wants us to have? He says Isaiah saw this fact clearly, and this is why he counseled every king for 40 years against all kinds of things that would have taken them out of God's favor. He says Isaiah is this way of obedience. It's a positive one, and the way to true self-fulfillment. For saying yes to God is never done at the expense of one's real self, only the unreal one. In other words, it's the false perceptions that we have for ourselves that keep us from thinking that God's will for our life is anything other than a positive thing. He says, in your will is my fulfillment. He ends by saying this, which I think is just beautiful. He said, would to God, the Holy One of Israel, that every one of us could do the same thing. If that could happen, then it would not just be a matter of our being proud to have Isaiah in our family tree. Then Isaiah could be proud of us, for we would have joined him in the great secret of joy. Just beautifully written. And this idea that what lies out ahead of us in the will of God is joy and fulfillment and wonder at what God might have for us next. I hope this has reached you well. Bless you until we meet again.